So one of the important thing to understand about Vipassana meditation or any form of meditation actually, that it is a long game. Yeah. And it's probably a good idea to build a strong foundation to progress in this long period of meditation practice. Yeah. So in this video, let's talk about what we can do to set ourselves for success in this kind of a meditation practice, right? Especially in a long term meditation practice. So, practicing 2 hours per day and practicing for those 2 hours diligently is like an anchor point, right? We have to do this every day to in order to make a progress. But in order to practice properly for those 2 hours, we need to make sure our conditions are correct, right? Otherwise, what happens is we're just gonna sit through those 2 hours, or we lose the motivation, or we just drop the practice for some time, pick up the practice again, and it won't create the right condition and causes for us to make the progress in the meditation the way it's supposed to be made, right? And we basic reason, at least in my understanding, based on like what I'm seeing in my life, is we generally tend to either drop the practice or become loose with our practice, or not do the practice consistently and diligently for a long period of time, because sometimes our foundational conditions are not that good. We didn't create a very strong foundation, right? So what are these foundation? What we can do so that we can practice for those 2 hours and make progress, and especially do it for a very long period of time, right? So what we can do about that? So there's a few things which seems to be pretty obvious, and it's really a good idea to set them up as a practice, right? So the first thing that comes to my mind is making sure that our body is healthy, right? You would notice, or at least I notice in my practice, right, that for whatever reason, if I'm not taking a good care of my body, it directly affects the meditation, right? If I'm not eating properly, or if I'm eating too much, too less, or not the right type of food, or if I'm not exercising the body or stretching the body, the quality of meditation start to degrade, right? At the same time, if I'm treating my body with respect, right, if I'm eating the right food in the right amount, and if I'm practicing something like yoga for just 30 minutes a day, and I'm sleeping properly, right, and altogether I'm taking a good care of my body, it has a direct effect on meditation, right? You will notice when you're sitting and practicing, you can practice more sincerely, right? And that's why I think in some other yoga tradition and all that, they put a lot of emphasis to make sure that your body is ready before you go into meditation, right? So at least in my observation, I noticed like it does make a lot of difference, right? Having a good, and again for the long term practice, right, it's probably a good idea to set it up as a good foundation, right? Doesn't have to be like from tomorrow all of a sudden I'm doing everything right, but think of in period of a year, right? It's possible for us to set up a good practices for eating healthy, giving a body right amount of rest, and exercising or stretching the body so that it stays healthy, right? Just in the period of long term, like a year or so, we can really set up these practices strongly, right? And that indirectly affects our meditation practice, or creates the right conditions for a meditation practice, right? So that's the one thing, making sure that our body is healthy, right? The second thing that comes to my mind is not engaging, being moderate with the sense pleasures, at least, right? This is one of the thing. It's also like one of the most what do you say, respected book is the Bhagavad Gita, and the Bhagavad Gita put a lot of emphasis on mastering your senses, right? And it just seems to be having this effect, right? If you engage so much into the senses, And the nature of senses, like any of five senses, right? It could be the food, or it could be the music, like any of these five senses. If we engage in these senses quite often, and they are pleasurable, there is a pleasure in them, right? So there's a natural tendency to engage in them. But if you engage too much in these senses, obviously it creates the attachment, and it creates a lot of craving for having those pleasures again and again and again. And obviously the mind becomes more noisy. At the same time, our desire for meditation, or desire for progressing uh, in vipassana and all these things, will start to degrade, right? It's almost like the more you move in this direction, the more you get out of the direction of meditation, liberation, etc., right? So being not overindulge into senses, right? Or keeping it moderate, or keeping it at minimal. Again, like, we don't want to go to extreme also, and I'm talking about again long term, right? So it's really not like from today I would never do this or never do that. Doesn't gonna work in the long term. But making sure that we engage in the senses with very much moderation is probably a good idea in the long term practice, right? If we don't engage in senses so much, this is one of the reason, because something like vipassana retreat, like 10-day retreat, creates a perfect environment, because you don't engage in the senses, you're eating the right food, and all these things create the right condition for us to progress in the meditation for those 10 days, right? So again, for the long term practice, it's probably a good idea to keep your involvement in the senses in the moderation, right? Keeping the body healthy, keeping the involvement with the senses in the moderation. These are kind of the conditions, right, that make. So once we have these things going on, when we sit down for meditation practice, it's easier to practice actually, and it's easier to progress in the practice, right? So what else we can do to set up a strong foundation? Like, when we engage so much into senses, you would notice your desire for meditation or inspiration start to degrade. At the same time, if we follow the precepts, if we follow the if we align our life with the precepts, again, without going to the extreme, never do this or always do that kind of thing, but aligning our life more and more with the precepts, right, makes the conditions within the mind, makes the mind very peaceful, right? And that kind of a mind is very much ready for meditation or growing in the meditation, right? So somehow, slowly aligning our life with the precepts is probably is it's actually setting up a very strong foundation, right? And again, doing this in the context of long term practice, right? It's very unlikely to get these things. It doesn't work on the rule level, right? It doesn't work like from, I don't I am following a precepts of uh, not lying or something, and then just follow that rule. It doesn't work like this. It's more, it has to first, I mean, in the beginning it's fine to follow that as a rule, but at some point it has to become your understanding that this is like a cause and effect relationship. If you do something like this with that intention, it creates the conditions inside the mind such that you're not going to be able to practice meditation, right? The mind just becomes very noisy, right? So having a life, having aligning our life with these kind of precepts creates the right conditions to progress in the meditation, right? So keeping the body healthy, making sure you're not so engaged with the senses, following the precepts or aligning your life with the precepts, and then just making sure our external life is sorted, right? By external life, I mean like basically relationship and your finances, right? If there is a survival, if our survival is not insured, right, it's probably a good idea to put more effort to sort out that part of our life compared to focus too much on the meditation, right? Because in the long term, these things, once these things are sorted, once they are not taking space in your head, it becomes more possible to progress in the meditation. But if in the mind it is all about if your survival is not sorted, and then that kind of urges and impulses are coming, it's better to solve that, it's better to sort that out so that you're free from that, right? The same thing with the relationships, right? Especially the core relationships. It's not particularly you should do this or do that, should get married or you should get divorced or whatever. But eventually we need to reach a point where we are free from these thoughts, right? Where we reach a point where we understand the nature of relationships, the nature of you know survival, and our basics need or our basic requirements are being met. You know, in another word, like sort out of our external life to the point where it is not affecting our internal mind so much, right? Obviously, there are endless desire about things, but there's some basic things that we need to make sure that we are taking care of, right? So this is what I mean. Like, so if we are doing meditation for, by long term I mean, like, I've been doing it for 10 years and I'm seeing myself doing it for another 20, 30 years, right? And having a strong foundation allow you to consistently practice and consistently grow in your practice, right? If we skip the foundation, then what happens is, like, because the practice is not consistent and diligent, it doesn't create the right conditions and causes to get the fruit of the practice, right? We get pulled into this direction, we get pulled into that direction, we are sitting in the meditation but we are not really practicing meditation. And when we have like a strong foundation, like we are practicing whatever we are practicing, but that practice has a right fruits, right? Because if the practice is correct, then it creates the right effect, right? So probably it's not just brute forcing to practice 2 hours per day or whatever, but also like thinking of setting up a good foundation. It could be different for different people, right? But setting up a good foundation is probably something we should also consider, other than just focusing only on the meditation. Yeah.